At the close of the 19th century, the United States was a country in the early stages of a transport transition that few fully understood. Horse-drawn vehicles still dominated American roads, which were mostly unpaved and unreliable outside of major cities. The railroad had already knit the continent together at an industrial scale, but individual mobility, the capacity of ordinary citizens to move freely without dependence on fixed schedules or hired conveyances, remained a practical limitation for most of the population. The bicycle had introduced a generation of Americans to personal mechanical transportation, and the carriage manufacturing trade was among the most established industries in the country. Into this environment, a scattering of engineers and mechanics across the northeastern and midwestern United States had begun experimenting with gasoline-powered vehicles, borrowing concepts largely from European patents. By 1900, fewer than 8,000 automobiles were registered in the entire country, and those that existed were considered luxury items for the wealthy. The roads, the supply chains, the fuel distribution networks, and the industrial capacity to produce vehicles at scale did not yet exist. The automobile was a curiosity, not a category. What was still absent was a manufacturing system, a viable price point, and an organizational commitment to producing for the mass market rather than the privileged few. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on a farm in Dearborn Township, Michigan, the son of Irish immigrant parents. He demonstrated a mechanical aptitude early, leaving farm work in his teens to become an apprentice machinist in Detroit and eventually working as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company, where he rose to chief engineer by 1893. Ford's personal experiments with gasoline engines ran in parallel to his employment, and he produced a working self-propelled vehicle, the quadricycle, in 1996. His two earlier attempts at establishing an automobile company, the Detroit Automobile Company in 1899 and the Henry Ford Company in 1901, each ended without producing commercially viable results. The second reorganization became the Cadillac Motor Company after Ford departed with the rights to his name. On June 16, 1903, Ford Motor Company was incorporated in Michigan, with 12 investors contributing a combined $28,000. Local banker John S. Gray was chosen as the company's first president, a deliberate decision meant to reassure investors skeptical of Ford's history of abandoning prior enterprises. The first factory occupied a converted wagon workshop on Mack Avenue in Detroit, and within weeks of incorporation, the company had produced and sold its first car, a two-cylinder Model A, delivering revenue before the end of its opening month. The organizational structure was modest, fewer than 200 employees, a rented facility, and a product line competing in a fragmented and unproven market. The early years of Ford Motor Company were defined by product iteration, capital uncertainty, and intensifying competitive pressure. The company progressed through a series of alphabetically designated models, the A, C, F, K, N, R, and S, each representing an effort to position the product against varying price points and market segments. The Model N, introduced in 1906 at approximately $500, was the company's first commercially successful design at a time when many competitors remained oriented towards wealthy buyers. The Selden patent dispute complicated this period considerably. George Selden held a broad patent on the gasoline automobile and had organized a licensing consortium, the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, that attempted to control who could build and sell cars in the United States. Ford refused to join and in 1903 became a defendant in what would become a prolonged and costly legal battle. Ford ultimately prevailed in the Court of Appeals in 1911, a ruling that opened the American automobile industry to broader competition and effectively dismantled the patent consortium. The legal outcome reinforced Ford's competitive position and freed the company to focus entirely on production expansion. By the time the case was resolved, Ford was already no longer the modest Mack Avenue operation that had entered the dispute. The Model T was introduced on October 1908 and represented a deliberate departure from the prevailing logic of automobile design. While competitors were producing multiple models at varied price points to serve different consumer segments, Henry Ford committed the company to a single design optimized for durability, simplicity of operation, and accessibility to American roads as they actually existed, which meant rough rural terrain, absence of repair infrastructure, and owners who had no mechanical training. The Model T was designed to be maintained in the field by ordinary users, with interchangeable parts and a mechanical straightforwardness that distinguished it from European vehicles oriented toward urban, wealthy buyers. The initial price of approximately $850 in 1908 was competitive, but Ford's stated ambition was to drive the price below $300 through manufacturing efficiency. The car featured a 4-cylinder, 20-horsepower engine, a planetary gear transmission operated by foot pedals, and a vanadium steel frame that was lighter and stronger than conventional steel of the period. By 1910, the company was producing tens of thousands annually, and by the time the Model T was discontinued in 1927, approximately 15 million units had been sold, a figure representing more than half of all automobiles produced worldwide during that period. No single vehicle in American automotive history sold in comparable volume relative to the state of the market at that time. The manufacturing transformation that made the Model T's volume possible was implemented at the Highland Park plant in suburban Detroit, which opened in January 2010 and was designed by industrial architect Albert Kahn. What occurred there between 1910 and 1914 constituted a systematic decomposition of the assembly process into specialized sequential operations performed at fixed stations. The moving assembly line, introduced on October 7, 1913, took the prior practice of stationary assembly, in which workers moved to parts, and inverted it. Parts and partially assembled vehicles moved on a continuous mechanical conveyor, while workers remained at fixed stations performing single repeated operations. The result was a reduction in assembly time per chassis from approximately 12 hours to approximately 90 minutes. The operational consequences were direct and measurable. As labor and time inputs fell, prices fell with them. The Model T sold for approximately $550 in 1913, $360 in 1916, and as low as $260 by the mid-1920s. This pricing trajectory placed automobile ownership within reach of the American industrial working class for the first time. The Highland Park system was studied, replicated, and adapted by manufacturers in virtually every sector of American industry in the decades that followed. The vocabulary of modern mass production, throughput, cycle time, workstation, standardized components emerged from this environment, and its application extended well beyond the automobile. On January 5, 1914, Ford Motor Company announced that it would raise the minimum daily wage for eligible workers to $5, more than double the prevailing industrial rate of approximately $2.34 per day, while simultaneously reducing the work shift from 9 hours to 8. The announced rationale combined profit sharing with productivity incentives, and the immediate result was a transformation of the company's labor market position. Ford had been experiencing an annual employee turnover rate reported at approximately 370%, a figure that reflected the physical demands of assembly line work and the availability of alternative employment in a growing industrial economy. The $5 day reduced turnover substantially and attracted a large pool of applicants. Thousands of men appeared at the Highland Park gates in the days following the announcement. The internal mechanism was not straightforward. A portion of the wage was classified as profit sharing, and eligibility required approval by a company body called the Sociological Department, which investigated employees' home lives, spending habits, and domestic arrangements. Workers who failed to meet the department's standards for sobriety, cleanliness, or domestic stability could be denied the profit-sharing component of the wage. The program generated considerable attention from economists and labor reformers, and its net effects on American wage standards were measurable over the following decade as competing manufacturers raised wages to retain workers. Ford extended this logic in May 1926 when the company instituted a 5-day, 40-hour work week, a scheduling norm that eventually became codified in federal labor law under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. The River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, represented the fullest expression of Henry Ford's concept of vertical integration as an industrial strategy. Construction began in 1917, and by the late 1920s, the facility had become what was, by most available measures, the largest integrated manufacturing complex in the world. The Rouge encompassed approximately 1.5 square miles, included more than 90 interconnected buildings with the combined floor space of roughly 16 million square feet, employed approximately 100,000 workers at its peak, operated its own railroad with more than 100 miles of internal track, maintained its own docks on the River Rouge waterway where ore-carrying ships could unload directly, and ran its own power plant, steel mill, glass plant, and rubber processing operations. Raw materials entered at one end, iron ore, coal, limestone, rubber, sand, and finished automobiles exited at the other. Ford owned forests in Michigan and Minnesota that supplied wood components, coal mines that fed the plant's energy systems, and rubber plantations in Brazil intended to reduce dependence on external suppliers. The degree of vertical control was without precedent in American manufacturing and reflected a specific theory of industrial self-sufficiency that Ford pursued with consistent intensity. The scale of the operation made it a subject of study for industrialists, economists, and labor organizers from across the world. The F-Series truck, introduced in 1948 as the company's first post-war purpose-built commercial vehicle lineup, became the most commercially durable product in Ford's history, and measured by cumulative North American sales volume, among the most sustained in the history of the domestic automotive market. The original F1 through F8 lineup represented a rationalization of Ford's light-duty truck offerings into a coherent, purpose-designated range designed for farm, construction, and commercial applications. Ford updated the F-Series through successive generations, the F100, introduced in 1953, and the evolution towards what became the F150 in 1975, refining cab comfort, payload capacity, engine options, and increasingly the interior appointments as the truck transitioned from a purely utilitarian tool to a vehicle used for personal transportation. The F-Series has held the position of America's best-selling vehicle for more than 4 consecutive decades, a record that no car, crossover, or competing truck nameplate has matched. As of the most recent public data available, cumulative F-Series sales have exceeded 40 million units in the North American market. The truck became embedded in American working identity in a way that transcended regional markets. It is the vehicle of the construction site, the ranch, the small business operator, and the suburban household across every state in the continental United States.
When the United States entered World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the federal government's need to rapidly convert civilian industrial capacity to military production created one of the most consequential mobilization efforts in American history. Ford Motor Company's contribution to that mobilization centered on the Willow Run bomber plant, a facility constructed in 1941 on farmland in Washtenaw County, Michigan, designed specifically for the mass production of the B-24 Liberator heavy bomber. The facility was designed by Albert Kahn and covered approximately 3.5 million square feet, with an assembly line extending more than 1 mile in length. Ford's engineers applied the same principles of standardized parts, sequential assembly, and continuous flow production to aircraft manufacturing that had been developed for the automobile over the preceding 30 decades. Early production rates were slow and attracted criticism from the War Department, but by 1944, the plant was producing approximately 1 B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Total production at Willow Run reached 8,685 B-24 Liberators, comprising approximately 6,792 complete aircraft and 1,893 aircraft in knockdown kit form by the time the last one was completed on June 28, 1945. The plant employed a peak workforce of approximately 42,000 people, of whom approximately 12,000 were women. Ford also produced military vehicles, including the GPW Jeep, armored cars, aircraft engines, and tank destroyers at other facilities during the war period, making the company's wartime industrial contribution one of the most extensive by any single manufacturer. The record of Ford Motor Company in the first half of the 20th century
includes documented episodes that complicate any account of the company's relationship to American democratic values. Between 1920 and 1927, the Dearborn Independent, a weekly newspaper owned by Henry Ford and distributed nationally through Ford dealerships, published anti-Semitic articles that reached a reported circulation of at least 900,000 copies per week by 1926. The newspaper serialized and distributed translated portions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a document that had already been identified as a fabrication, and published a multi-volume collection titled The International Jew, which attributed economic and social problems to Jewish influence. A German translation was produced in 1922. Nazi leader Baldur Schirach stated in post-war testimony that the material influenced his adoption of anti-Semitic views, and Hitler was reported to keep copies of The International Jew, as well as a portrait of Ford in his Munich office. Ford issued a public retraction in 1927 following a libel lawsuit brought by Chicago attorney Aaron Sapiro, claiming ignorance of the content. An explanation that subsequent historical scholarship, including American Jewish historical researchers who documented Ford's final approval authority over the paper's content, has generally not accepted as complete. Separately, the company's resistance to labor union organizing in the 1930s produced documented acts of violence. On May 26, 1937, union organizers, including Walter Reuther, were physically attacked by members of Ford's internal security organization, the Service Department, led by Harry Bennett, on an overpass outside the River Rouge plant. Photographs of the incident, circulated widely in the national press, became known in labor historical literature as the Battle of the Overpass. The institutional consequences of the labor conflicts of the 1930s reached their formal resolution when Ford Motor Company signed a contract with the United Automobile Workers Union in June 1941, becoming the last of the three principal Detroit automakers to do so, following General Motors in 1937 and Chrysler the same year. The contract resulted in wage increases and formal grievance procedures. Henry Ford's personal opposition to unionization had been consistent and documented over more than 20 years. His acquiescence in 1941 was attributed in some accounts to the intervention of his wife Clara. Henry Ford suffered a series of strokes in the later 30s and 40s and ceded increasing operational control to Bennett and other subordinates during the final decade before his death in April 1947. His grandson, Henry Ford II, brought back from naval service to assist in management in September 1945, assumed the company's presidency in September 1945, immediately dismantled the Bennett organizational apparatus, and undertook a systematic management restructuring with assistance from a group of former Army Air Force's statistical analysts who became known within the company as the Whiz Kids. The institutional response to the anti-Semitic publications of the Dearborn Independent developed slowly across subsequent decades. The Ford family's public posture on the question has evolved across generations, and the degree of Henry Ford's personal editorial involvement in the specific content of those publications remains a subject of ongoing historical discussion. In the mid-1950s, Ford Motor Company undertook an effort to introduce an entirely new automotive brand positioned between the Ford and Mercury lines, intended to capture a segment of the middle-income market that had expanded through the post-war economic expansion. The vehicle, named the Edsel after Henry Ford's only son, was introduced in September 1957 following several years of development and a reported investment of approximately $250 million. The Edsel featured distinctive styling, most notably a vertical oval grille that attracted immediate critical commentary, as well as several mechanical features, including a push-button transmission control mounted in the steering wheel hub, which proved prone to operational failure in service. The timing coincided with a national economic recession in 1957 and 1958 that compressed discretionary spending on large consumer purchases. Sales fell substantially below projections in every model year. Ford had estimated sales of approximately 200,000 units annually. Actual first-year sales reached approximately 63,000, and the figure declined further in each subsequent year. The Edsel was discontinued after the 1960 model year, and Ford's total losses on the program were estimated at approximately $350 million. The vehicle became a frequently cited case study in marketing and business literature on consumer expectation, the relationship between pre-launch publicity and purchase behavior, and the limits of market research methodology as practiced in that period.
The Ford Mustang, introduced at the New York World's Fair on April 17, 1964, was the product of a development effort led primarily by Ford Division General Manager Lee Iacocca, who had championed a sporty, affordable personal car targeted at the post-war baby boom generation entering early adulthood. The design brief was precise: a vehicle priced under $2,500, weighing under 2,500 pounds, measuring under 180 inches in length, and capable of carrying 4 passengers. The production Mustang debuted at a base price of $2,368 and was available in fastback, hardtop, and convertible configurations, with a wide range of option packages allowing buyers to configure the vehicle to individual preference. First-year sales reached approximately 400,000 units, substantially exceeding Ford's internal projection of 100,000 annually. And the 1 millionth Mustang was produced within approximately 2 years of introduction. The nameplate defined a product segment, the personal pony car, that competitors, including General Motors and Chrysler, moved to join within the following model years. The Mustang became the most commercially successful new vehicle introduction since the Model A in 1927, and one of the most recognizable American automotive products in international markets. The nameplate has remained in continuous production for more than 60 years through 6 generational redesigns, a record of continuity that few automotive nameplates in any market have matched.
In 1963, Henry Ford II authorized a program to compete at the highest level of international endurance racing, a decision that originated in part from a failed acquisition negotiation with Ferrari. Ford had approached Enzo Ferrari about purchasing his company. Negotiations collapsed when Ferrari withdrew from the final terms, reportedly unwilling to cede control of his racing operations. Ford's response was to develop a purpose-built Le Mans prototype from the foundation up. The resulting vehicle, designated the GT40, was developed in collaboration with British constructor Lola Cars and refined through successive iterations in 1964 and 1965, during which the program experienced mechanical failures that prevented a race victory. In 1966, running a substantially revised and more powerful version equipped with a 7.0-liter Ford engine, the GT40 team achieved a first-place finish at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, with Ford cars finishing first, second, and third overall, ending Ferrari's consecutive winning streak at the event. Ford won at Le Mans again in 1967, 1968, and 1969. The program required an investment in motorsport engineering unusual for an American manufacturer, and produced technical and organizational talent that fed back into Ford's production vehicle programs. The 1966 Le Mans result has received sustained attention in automotive historical literature and broad popular media, including a major theatrical film released in 2019. The Ford Pinto, a subcompact vehicle introduced in 1970 as Ford's response to competition from imported small cars, became the subject of one of the most analyzed product safety controversies in American automotive history. The Pinto was developed under an accelerated timeline, approximately 25 months from concept to production, compared to industry standard of approximately 43 months. And post-production testing identified that a rear-end collision at certain speeds could cause the fuel tank to rupture and the filler pipe to be displaced, creating a fire risk. Internal Ford documentation that became public through civil litigation in the late 1970s showed that company engineers had identified the issue and that a cost-benefit analysis had been prepared, weighing the cost of a hardware fix against estimated liability calculated from projected injuries and deaths using actuarial values drawn from federal safety standards documents. This analysis became central to civil and criminal proceedings against the company, including a 1978 criminal indictment in Indiana, the first time a major American corporation had been charged with criminal homicide in connection with a product, though the company was ultimately acquitted. The National Highway Safety Administration opened a formal investigation in 1977 and ultimately ordered a recall of approximately 1.5 million Pintos. The precise number of deaths attributable specifically to the fuel tank design has been disputed in published academic research. Contemporary journalistic estimates ranged widely, and subsequent analyses have challenged some of the higher figures. The episode entered American Business School curricula as a case study in the ethics of quantitative risk assessment applied to product safety decisions.
The decade following the 1973 oil embargo was among the most financially difficult in Ford's commercial history. Fuel prices that had been stable for decades rose sharply and remained elevated, shifting consumer preference towards smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles at a moment when Ford's product range remained weighted towards larger, less efficient designs. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, had established meaningful positions in the American market with vehicles that combined fuel efficiency with quality standards that, in measured assessments conducted during the period, consistently exceeded those of domestic competitors. Ford's market share fell,
profitability contracted, and by 1980, the company posted annual losses of approximately $1.5 billion. The recovery effort that followed was partly financial and partly technical. Ford introduced a range of front-wheel drive vehicles and significantly improved its manufacturing quality metrics through the early 1980s, guided in part by quality management methodologies associated with statistician Edwards Deming. The 1986 Ford Taurus, designed by Jack Telnack with an aerodynamic rounded body form that contrasted with the upright styling that had characterized American sedans, became the best-selling car in the United States by 1992 and held that position for several years. The Taurus demonstrated that a domestic manufacturer could produce a vehicle competitive with Japanese imports on design, quality, and commercial appeal simultaneously. And its introduction is generally treated in automotive historical analysis as a pivot point in Ford's competitive standing during that era. The F-150 pickup truck has occupied a position in American commercial life that extends beyond simple sales figures. For more than 4 consecutive decades, the F-Series has been the best-selling vehicle in the United States, a record that has persisted through fuel crises, recessions, and competitive challenges from General Motors' Silverado and Chevrolet's competing platforms. The F-150's sustained dominance reflects structural features of the American economy and geography. A substantial rural and semi-rural population engaged in agriculture, construction, and small-scale enterprise, an expansive road network designed around private vehicle ownership, and a cultural identification of the pickup truck with practical capability and working economic identity that has proven durable across decades. Ford allocates production of the F-150 across multiple assembly facilities and has historically generated profit margins on the F-Series that subsidize losses and thin margins elsewhere in the product range. Industry analysts have noted that the F-Series generates a disproportionate share of Ford's total operating profit relative to its unit volume, making the truck platform the financial foundation upon which the company's overall operations depend. The F-150's aluminum body construction, introduced in the 2015 model year following an intensive manufacturing retooling across Ford's truck assembly plants, reduced vehicle weight by approximately 700 pounds and demonstrated the company's willingness to accept significant short-term production disruption in pursuit of structural product improvement. By the mid-2000s, Ford Motor Company faced a convergence of operational, competitive, and financial pressures that had been building across decades. Rising fuel costs compressed margins on large trucks and SUVs at the moment when Ford's product mix was most dependent on them. Labor costs remained high under union auto workers' contracts structured in earlier decades when the company's market position was stronger. Quality metrics remained measurably below Japanese competitors, and Ford's brand portfolio, which had expanded to include Jaguar, Land Rover, Volvo, and Aston Martin, had produced acquisition costs without commensurate financial returns. In 2006, Ford posted a net loss of approximately $12.6 billion. William Clay Ford, Jr., the great-great-grandson of Henry Ford, who had served as chief executive since 2001, recruited Alan Mulally from Boeing to take the CEO role that year. Mulally implemented a program he called One Ford, which prioritized consolidation of the vehicle lineup, elimination of redundant platforms, transparency in internal reporting, and a commitment to building globally competitive vehicles. In November 2006, Ford mortgaged substantially all of its assets, including factories, equipment, intellectual property, and the Blue Oval trademark, to secure approximately $23.6 billion in credit. This action provided a liquidity buffer that allowed Ford to fund its restructuring without requiring federal assistance when the 2008 financial crisis arrived. Ford did not accept a government bailout, distinguishing it from General Motors and Chrysler, both of which entered structured bankruptcy proceedings in 2009. Ford returned to profitability in 2009 and posted continued earnings improvement through the early 2010s. Ford entered the 2020s with a structural challenge that remains unresolved as of mid-2026. Jim Farley, who became Chief Executive Officer in October 2020, reorganized the company into 3 operating units: Ford Blue, covering internal combustion engine vehicles; Ford Pro, covering commercial vehicles and fleet services; and Ford Model E, covering battery electric vehicles. The reorganization was intended to allow the Electric Vehicle Development Unit to operate with greater speed and to make the financial performance of each segment visible independently. The F-150 Lightning, a battery electric version of Ford's flagship truck, introduced to production in April 2022, was positioned as a central expression of Ford's electrification commitment. However, the economics of the Model E segment proved difficult to manage. The unit reported losses of approximately $4.7 billion in 2023 and approximately $4.8 billion in 2024. In December 2025, Ford announced that it would discontinue production of the all-electric F-150 Lightning, citing insufficient demand and the inability to achieve profitability on the all-electric platform, and indicated that the Lightning name would be retained on a future plug-in hybrid incorporating a gasoline-powered range extender. The Model E division's losses are projected to reach between $4 and $4.5 billion in 2026, with a company stated target of profitability by 2029. Ford's EV strategy has shifted towards a smaller, lower-cost vehicle platform and away from large electric trucks and SUVs, where consumer demand has been below initial projections. Ford Blue and Ford Pro have continued to generate operating profit, primarily on the basis of F-Series trucks and commercial vehicles. Ford Motor Company enters its second century as an organization still shaped in direct and traceable ways by the industrial logic developed in Detroit and Dearborn across the first half of the 20th century. The moving assembly line did not remain a Ford-exclusive method. It propagated outward into every sector of American manufacturing and became one of the fundamental structures of modern industrial production globally. The $5 day altered the calculus of American wage setting at a moment when the boundaries between industrial labor and middle-class economic participation were being negotiated for the first time. The F-Series truck, introduced in an economy still recovering from the disruptions of World War II and sustained through every subsequent economic cycle, represents the longest-running continuous evidence of the company's ability to identify and serve a durable segment of the American market. The controversies that mark the company's history, the anti-Semitic publications of the 1920s, the labor violence of the 1930s, the Pinto safety episode of the 1970s, and the current losses in the transition to battery electric propulsion are not marginal details but substantive components of the record of an organization that operated at national scale through repeated periods of social and economic transformation. What Ford built was not merely a product catalog, but a set of organizational methods, wage standards, and consumer expectations that reshaped the material conditions of American life across more than a century. Whether its current leadership will successfully navigate the transition to electrified propulsion, and whether the F-Series commercial dominance will endure through the structural changes underway in the American vehicle market, are questions that the existing record cannot yet answer. What the record does establish with considerable clarity is that Ford Motor Company was central to the industrialization of the American economy and has remained, through multiple cycles of expansion and difficulty, among the principal institutions of American manufacturing.